is meeting today to examine the Transportation Security Administration's preparation for and response to emergencies at airports. Before we begin, I want to welcome all the witnesses and extend my thanks for participating in today's hearing. I appreciate the effort taken on behalf of all those involved to have this important field hearing. This is an official congressional hearing as opposed to a town hall meeting, and as such, we must abide by certain rules of the Committee on Homeland Security and of the House of Representatives. I kindly wish to remind our guests today that demonstrations from the audience, including applause and verbal outbursts, as well as the use of signs or placards, are a violation of the rules of the House of Representatives. Also, photography and cameras are limited to accredited press only. It is important that we respect the decorum and the rules of the committee. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I would like to thank our witnesses for their participation in this hearing and their commitment to aviation security. I also want to acknowledge the sacrifice of TSA Officer Hernandez, who lost his life here on November 1st, 2013. It is my sincere hope that this hearing not only reminds us of the horrible events of that day, but also motivates us to make changes that will improve our ability to detect and deter potential threats and respond to future emergencies. I believe we owe it to Mr. Hernandez and all those impacted by this shooting to examine the facts and shed light on the details and the timeline of this incident in an open setting. That alone is the purpose of today's hearing. The shooting that occurred here at LAX exposed significant weaknesses in the ability of federal and local personnel to communicate and coordinate during an emergency. Weaknesses that I suspect exist in other airports across the country. Perhaps these weaknesses stem from resource constraints or clashes between agencies, or a belief that an incident like this is unlikely. It is certainly easier to push emergency planning and exercises off to sometime in the distant future rather than making them a top priority for today when you have so many other competing demands for time and resources. Having said that, I think most of my colleagues will agree that 13 years after 9/11, these types of flaws cannot be tolerated regardless of the reasons. Based on the reports completed by Los Angeles World Airports and TSA, it appears there is widespread agreement on this. According to Los Angeles World Airports, the response and recovery efforts that followed the November 1st shooting lasted roughly 30 hours. The shooting affected over 1,500 flights and 171,000 passengers. Among the findings in its report, LAWA highlights significant coordination and communication challenges among local first responders. I agree with LAWA's assertion that airport security needs to become more risk-based, emergency communications needs to be more streamlined, and there must be a unified incident command set up immediately after an event like this. While the report provided details on certain aspects of the response, LAWA's report conspicuously excludes any mention of where the two officers assigned to Terminal 3 were at the time the first shots rang out and what impact, if any, this may or may not have had. I believe the location of these officers is crucial to understanding the viability of a flexible response to screen checkpoints, especially when you combine it with the lack of inoperable radio communications that we know exists. If we do not have law enforcement officers stationed at heavily trafficked screening checkpoints or ticket counters, we should at least have confidence that we know exactly when the first officers will be there to respond to an active shooter or to an emergency. I look forward to discussing this issue in greater detail today. In addition to LAWA's report, we've had the benefit of reviewing TSA's recent report, which highlights several recommendations, recommended actions, including mandatory active shooter training for screeners, improved communication systems, and enhanced law enforcement officer presence at checkpoints and ticket counters during peak travel times. The bottom line is TSA cannot do it alone. It must rely on its local law enforcement partners in an event like this. Before I conclude my remarks, I would like to remind members that we're on a very tight schedule here today with folks flying out at various times this afternoon. So I will be enforcing the 5-minute rule for all members so that we're hopefully able to get through 2 full rounds of questions. My intention is to hold a second hearing in Washington to follow up on this hearing to look more broadly at what lessons we can learn once we put the facts on the record here today and how they can be applied to airports nationwide. And I welcome all members to attend that hearing as well. I now will recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Thompson, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important field hearing today. At the outset, I'd like to acknowledge Executive Directors Lenz and Chief Gannon of the Los Angeles World Airports for their hospitality. Your willingness to aid the committee in its oversight by hosting the hearing and accommodating our members' request to tour the site of this tragic shooting of November 1st, 2013 is appreciated. To Administrator Pistol, thank you for appearing before the subcommittee to discuss TSA's findings in the wake of the shooting and plan reforms to mitigate any similar incident in the future. We place the security of our aviation sector in the hands of men and women of the Transportation Security Administration every day. Those on the front lines, the transportation security officers, deserve to know that we are doing everything within our power to see that they themselves are secure when performing the critical job of screening passengers. I'm pleased that the national president of the American Federation of Government Employees, J. David Cox, is appearing before the subcommittee today to give voice to the transportation security officer workforce. As has been well documented, on November 1st, 2013, an armed gunman entered Terminal 3 of Los Angeles International Airport and opened fire on transportation security officer Hernandez. The gunman then proceeded through the terminal, targeting other TSA employees, shooting and injuring transportation security officers Grigsby and Spear. Thanks to the bravery of the police officers on duty, the gunman was ultimately taken down and prevented from causing further harm. While some may wish to point fingers and assign blame for this horrific incident, I believe doing so would be counterproductive. All of our energy should be directed toward not only learning from the incident, but also implementing needed reforms. Frequently, we speak of lessons learned from a tragedy, but fail to implement the reforms necessary to prevent those lessons from having to be learned again. For instance, after 9/11, we identified that communication between and amongst first responders was an area that needed major reforms. Despite knowing this and having spent $13 billion to correct the problem, a review of the report the airport released last week reveals that more than a decade after 9/11, the police and fire department at this critical airport could not communicate effectively during an emergency. The tools transportation security officers have been trained to use in the event of emergency did not work. The state of affairs is unacceptable. Our police, firefighters, transportation security officers, and emergency medical personnel, along with the American public, deserve better. Had the shooter at LAX on November 1st been intent upon firing upon passengers rather than targeting TSA personnel, untold lives could have been lost. In addition to the communication issue, I have concerns regarding the training transportation security officers receive for active shooter scenarios. I look forward to hearing from Administrator Pistol on how he intends to ensure all TSOs are trained to respond to an active shooter scenario in a manner relevant to their work environment. Before yielding back, Mr. Chairman, I would like to acknowledge Representative Waters, who represents the district the airport is in, and Representative Brownlee for their participation in the hearing today. I also, Mr. Chairman, ask unanimous consent that Representative Waters and Brownlee be allowed to sit and question the witnesses at the hearing today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and without objection, we welcome Ms. Waters and Ms. Brownlee. At this time, the chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Hudson. I would like to first offer my sincere condolences to Officer Hernandez's wife, Anna, who we met with briefly before this hearing. I also want to recognize the TSA officers, Grigsby and Spear. From what I've seen, you're true heroes, what you did that day, and we appreciate your service. I want to thank the chairman for his leadership on this issue. I also want to thank the Los Angeles World Airport for hosting us, Chief Gannon, who gave us a tour of the terminal this morning, and John Pistol, TSA, and Ms. Lindsay, thank you for your hosting us and giving us the briefings this morning. They were very informative and very insightful. It's critical that agencies responsible for protecting our airports are doing all that they can to keep passengers and employees safe. I believe this hearing is an important opportunity to examine lessons learned from the shooting, what went well and what didn't, how we should apply those lessons learned to other airports as we move forward. Unfortunately, we live in a very dangerous world. Events like the one that happened here are difficult, if not impossible, to prevent. But what we can do is improve our ability to detect the threats before someone starts shooting or detonates a bomb or hops a fence or takes advantage of any security loophole or vulnerability that we have failed to close for one reason or another. As chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security, I know how committed our law enforcement officers are and our transportation security officers are, day in and day out, to stay ahead of any potential threat. And yet the tragedy that the world watched unfold at this airport could very likely happen again at another airport in the future. So we need to be prepared for that, wherever and whenever it may happen. There are valuable lessons to be learned here today by this incident. But first, we need to dissect exactly what happened. Among the shortcomings in the response to the shooting, we know that all relevant agencies did not join together in a unified command structure until 45 minutes after the shooting occurred. Even then, the Los Angeles Fire Department did not join the unified command. This, along with a lack of, in some cases, interoperable communications, made the job executing an effective response more difficult. What is perhaps most concerning about the problems identified after the incident is if the government had been shooting randomly rather than targeting TSA, we would have seen much greater loss of life. Dozens, if not hundreds of people could have been killed within the 4.5 minutes it took officers to detain the government. Also, on the day of the shooting, airport police were operating vehicle checkpoints and stopping certain vehicles to check for anything suspicious. Yet, as the airport's report points out, it is possible the shooter actually went through one of these checkpoints and the officers were not able to detect or deter him. There is no such thing as 100% security. But this situation reminds us that we cannot become complacent. We need to constantly stay ahead of potential threats with proven tactics and techniques. And there are some parallels to what happened at the Washington Navy Yard just a month and a half before this incident occurred. But I do want to close on a very positive note. I think what we saw today with Miss Lindsay and Chief Gannon and John Pistol, not only prior to the shooting, and what was done at the shooting to stop the shooter, to stop more bloodshed. The heroes that day, as I point out, are TSO officers. And Chief, great work that you did. I must say, I walked away very impressed with how this incident was handled by all the relevant agencies, but also the way they have looked in a self-critical way to examine what can be done better. And I think that's what it's all about. How can we do a better job so we can prevent this from happening again? And I must say I'm very, very proud of the Los Angeles police, airport police, Miss Lindsay, your efforts with the airport, and Mr. Pistol, what you've done with TSA to make this place a safer airport. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for any statement she may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Might I add my appreciation to you, Mr. Richmond, and also to the chairman and ranking member of the full Committee of Homeland Security. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, Congresswoman Waters, who has, with a great honor, served this community and shown great compassion for these issues, and to congratulate Congresswoman Bromley for her leadership on very important legislation that I hope will be passed and that the President will sign. I thank all of you for coming to this hearing, and particularly the witnesses, Mr. Pistol, for the service to this nation, Ms. Lindsay, for your guidance of this great airport, and along with your colleague, Chief Gannon, who eloquently presented the case today of November 2013. Mr. Cox, thank you so very much for standing very strong and tall for first responders in the name of TSO officers. Today we will learn what we can do to prevent or mitigate a similar incident in the future. At the onset, I would like to acknowledge that the ranking member of the subcommittee, our friend and colleague, Mr. Richmond of Louisiana, could not attend the hearing today, although he wanted to very much. He has requested that I express his regret, which I will do, and ask that I sit in his place during the hearing today. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that Ranking Member Richmond's prepared statement be inserted in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Again, I thank all of the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. A special thanks, as I already said, to Executive Director Lindsay and Chief Gannon for hosting us, and again to Administrator Pistol and National President Cox, our friend, and a friend to working men and women, for traveling to appear before this subcommittee. Today, we have the honor and privilege of having Officer Hernandez's wife present with us today. And as we chatted about her wonderful children, I thought it was important to acknowledge to all of the TSO officers, including Mr. Grisby and Mrs. Spear, let it be very clear that you serve in this nation's defense and that TSO officers across America are first responders and they're serving to protect our national security. Mrs. Hernandez, as I said, your husband fell in the line of duty serving his nation, and we are grateful to all of you for your sacrifice and your willing to sacrifice. Saddened that it has occurred, but we thank you for your presence here today. Today's hearing focuses on an issue that I have closely observed during my time in Congress and as a member of the Homeland Security Committee. That is the safety and security of our aviation system and airports. For years, I served as either the chair or ranking member of this subcommittee, and worked to enhance aviation security and the security of our critical infrastructure. Indeed, I was the principal author of the last Transportation Security Administration Authorization Act to pass the House of Representatives, and I would hope that we'd soon have an opportunity to look at that again for the many changes that we may need to include. Understanding the importance of training for transportation security officers, that legislation contained a section focused on the establishment of a centralized training facility for the workforce. I look forward to hearing from Administrator Pistol today on how he intends to train the entire transportation security officer workforce on active shooter scenarios in a setting resembling their workplace environment, a crucial element to the many TSO officers across America. Today's hearing also focuses on a topic of great interest to me in light of a similar incident having occurred, as I mentioned earlier today, in Houston, Texas. Last May, a man entered Houston Bush Intercontinental Airport, sat in the departure area for over an hour without being confronted, and subsequently fired shots into the ceiling near a ticketing area. Thankfully, no passengers or airport personnel were injured in that incident. The shooter ultimately took his own life. As an additional point, it was a TSO officer that first acknowledged or thought that there was something suspicious about this individual. Ultimately, as this TSO officer confronted the individual, and the Department of Homeland Security law enforcement agent came out from another direction and was part of the overcoming of the individual, even though he had begun to look as if he was going to take his own life. Taken together, the shootings at LAX and Houston Bush Intercontinental Airport show that airports are target-rich environments, as unfortunate as that may seem. Whether it is the airplane, whether it is the area where passengers are, or whether or not it is in the open space and secure areas where TSO officers are manning. Knowing that it is incumbent upon us to implement recommendations and modify policies where appropriate that will make the airport environment more secure for passengers, airport personnel, and transportation security officers. Undoubtedly, doing so will require resources and support from state and local and federal authorities. When an incident occurs that prompts a response from multiple law enforcement agencies, our communication systems are only as good as their weakest link. Our challenge today is to make the weakest link as strong as possible. It does no good for Los Angeles World Airports to invest millions in new radios and communication systems if the surrounding jurisdictions fail to do so. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to listening to the testimony, and I'll submit the rest of my statement into the record.
Thank you, gentlelady. And other members are reminded that you may submit written statements for the record. We're pleased now to introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses here with us today. First, we have the Honorable John Pistol. He's been the administrator of the Transportation Security Administration at the Department of Homeland Security since 2010. As TSA administrator, he oversees and manages approximately 60,000 employees, the security operations of more than 450 federalized airports throughout the United States, the Federal Air Marshal Service, and the security for highways, railroad, mass transit systems, and pipelines. Ms. Gina Marie Lindsay was appointed Executive Director of Los Angeles World Airport in June 2007. She has over 20 years' experience in airport management. Ms. Lindsay has previously served as Managing Director for the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and Director of Aviation for Anchorage International Airport. And we thank you for hosting us here today. Next, Mr. Patrick Gannon was appointed to the position of Chief of Airport Police for Los Angeles World Airports in November 2012. As Chief of Airport Police, Mr. Gannon leads over 1,100 police officers, security officers, and civilian staff protecting LAX and other nearby airports, and ensures compliance with TSA mandates, airport rules and regulations, and international, federal, state, and local laws. Chief Gannon retired from the Los Angeles Police Department in 2012 after 34 years of service. Finally, Mr. J. David Cox is the National President of the Association of the American Federation of Government Employees, the largest federal employee union representing 650,000 federal and D.C. government workers nationwide and overseas. And also point out significantly that Mr. Cox is from the 8th District of North Carolina, from Kannapolis originally, so he's my constituent. So I always want to make note of that. So I thank all the witnesses for being here today. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair recognizes Administrator Pistol to testify first.
Well, thank you, Chairman Hudson and Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, Ranking Member Jackson Lee, Congresswomen Waters and Brownlee for the holding this field hearing today on this important topic. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before you with these other distinguished witnesses. The events of November 1 demonstrated the bravery of our frontline workforce as well as their commitment to TSA's mission of protecting the nation's transportation system. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, TSA took a number of actions which I'd like to outline in my oral statement, including assembling a crisis action team to advise me and to ensure communication and engagement with the workforce and stakeholders regarding the event. I called for a comprehensive review of TSA policies, procedures, and training to identify improvements to the safety and security for TSA employees and, by extension, the traveling public. After meeting with the family of Officer Hernandez, and thank you for recognizing Anna and for recognizing Officers Grigsby and Spear, the day after the shooting, I met with them. I then had our senior leadership team to take the following steps. First, we communicated with our workforce with what we knew, and then with frequent updates. Second, I convened a meeting of external stakeholders where I requested inputs for actions the agency could take or consider to improve officer safety and security. Third, I directed an internal team to assess options and to make recommendations. Fourth, I redirected a number of our visible intermodal protection and response, or VIPER teams, from their surface transportation missions to LAX and other high-profile airports to serve as a deterrent to a shooter. From these reviews and assessments, we received hundreds of ideas and have implemented over a dozen of them. Now, employees from all levels of TSA contributed ideas through what we call our Idea Factory, and in over 100 town halls that I and other senior leadership team members have convened. We continue to welcome stakeholder and workforce feedback as we remain engaged in advancing further recommendations. In that regard, I want to recognize the immediate and ongoing engagement our senior leadership team here at LAX, headed by Federal Security Director Darby LaJoy and his team, has had with our over 2,100 employees here at LAX, obviously the largest contingent of TSA employees of any airport in the country. And to thank each and every TSA employee, particularly here at LAX and Terminal 3, for their resiliency and their dedication to the mission. I also want to thank LAWA, particularly Executive Director Gina Marie Lindsay, and to the LAWA Police and Chief Pat Gannon for their strong partnership prior to November 1 and since that day. The LAX shooting raised a number of issues about the training we provide to our TSA employees. And while they have received a number of different types of training, active shooter scenario training was not a primary focus. Since November 1, I've mandated all TSA employees receive this training, and pleased to report that over 98% of our over 60,000 employees have completed this training. In support of further efforts to reinforce emergency procedures, we have incorporated a reminder in our shift briefs regarding the evacuation routes and rendezvous points identified in the local mitigation plan. As part of our review, we studied how officers notify law enforcement of an emergency most effectively and determined that we need to do two things. One, regularly test existing alarms, and two, acquire and install many more alarms in airports around the country. Interoperability of communications between TSA and, in fact, most federal agencies and state and local authorities continues to be a challenge nationwide, but some progress is being made. We also directed federal security directors to ensure all TSA-owned wireless devices are pre-programmed with their local emergency numbers and to provide employees with those numbers to allow them to voluntarily program them into their personal devices. In addition, as a best practice, we are recommending airports link duress alarms and CCTV systems to ensure that when a duress alarm is received, a predetermined set of CCTV views would be programmed to automatically focus on the location of the alarm. After carefully studying the presence of law enforcement officers at checkpoints with extensive input from stakeholders, TSA is also taking the following actions, including incorporating maximum response times in the airport security programs, and then recommending standards for increased law enforcement presence at high airport locations, such as peak travel times at checkpoints and ticket counters, to provide a visible deterrent and quicker response times. In conclusion, the senseless shooting of Officer Hernandez and 3 others once again reminds us of the dangerous world in which we live. The shooting has served as a catalyst for TSA to assess existing safety and security policies, technologies, and partnerships. And we know there is no 100% guarantee in preventing terrorists and others from doing bad things. Yet we believe, based on the extensive input we received, the actions I've outlined today provide a measured approach to mitigate risk without trying to eliminate it. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Administrator Pistol. The chair recognizes Chief Gannon now to testify.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, welcome to Los Angeles International Airport. I am Patrick Gannon, Deputy Executive Director at Los Angeles World Airports for Law Enforcement and Homeland Security and Chief of the Los Angeles Airport Police. Airport Police is the primary law enforcement agency for Los Angeles World Airports with a staff of 1,100, of which approximately 525 are sworn, approximately 400 are security officers, and the rest are professional support staff. Los Angeles Airport Police is committed to ongoing training. In fact, an active shooting exercise was held 3 weeks prior to the November 1st shooting. During this 2-day training exercise, we trained over 350 airport police officers, Los Angeles police officers, and Los Angeles city firefighters to respond to an active shooter in an airport environment. We conducted this training in an old terminal at one of our airports. This training proved to be very helpful as we faced a gun-wielding man at Terminal 3. As you know, on November the 1st, 2013, the alleged shooter, Paul Ciancia, entered Terminal 3 on the departure level near a ticket counter. He walked to a nearby queuing line at the foot of an escalator leading up to the security checkpoint and gate area. At the bottom of the escalator was a TSA podium staffed by TSA Officer Geraldo Hernandez. At 9:20 a.m., Ciancia removed an assault rifle from his luggage and shot Officer Hernandez multiple times. He went up the escalator just a few steps, but then turned and came back down and shot Officer Hernandez once again. As the initial shots were fired, passengers ducked for cover. Within seconds, TSA officers at the upper level checkpoint urged passengers to move away from where the shots were being fired. A number of TSA officers acted heroically and put themselves in jeopardy to make sure passengers got out of the line of fire. I would like to specifically recognize TSA officers Tony Grigsby and Jane Spear for their heroic and selfless actions as they put themselves in harm's way to protect passengers who were slow to exit the area. 10 seconds after the first shots were fired, a call came into Airport Police Dispatch. The call was made by a TSA supervisor who was forced to run from the area and was unable to provide information about the shooting. Shortly thereafter, an airline contract service employee who was near Officer Hernandez used his cellular telephone to call Airport Police. Within a minute or so, Airport Police had a full description of the shooter and responded as quickly as possible. Following the initial shooting, Ciancia went up the escalator through the evacuated TSA screening area and into the terminal concourse, apparently looking for other TSA officers. Once again, he fired his assault-type weapon as people scurried for cover. This is approximately the point where he shot and wounded TSA officers Grigsby and Spear and one additional passenger. Airport police officers quickly converged on Terminal 3 from many different directions. As the officers arrived, they were directed towards Ciancia by a number of people in the terminal. The officers eventually confronted Ciancia in the terminal near Gate 35, where an officer-involved shooting took place. Ciancia was stopped and taken into custody. The shooting of Officer Hernandez took place at approximately 9:20 a.m. 1 minute and 22 seconds later, our Airport Police Dispatch Center broadcast a shots fired call in Terminal 3. At 9:25 a.m., airport police officers reported the suspect was down near Gate 35. 4 minutes and 8 seconds elapsed from the time that the news of the shooting was broadcast by our dispatch center to the time that our officers reported the shooter was down in the terminal and in custody. There has been speculation that this event may have been prevented if an airport police officer was posted at the TSA screening checkpoint in Terminal 3. The facts are that a podium-based officer at the checkpoint would not have prevented this murder, and due to the layout of the checkpoint, the officer would not have been in a position to keep Ciancia from attacking Officer Hernandez. In certain circumstances, I believe that a podium-based officer would be more vulnerable in a carefully planned attack. Law enforcement has made considerable changes in the way it responds to active shooter incidents. At Columbine High School, it was 46 minutes before law enforcement was able to make entry into that school. To respond and neutralize Ciancia within 4 minutes and 8 seconds from the first call to when we had the shooter in custody, in my estimation, is remarkable. Even so, we continually look for ways to improve our response time. Even though we work each day to prevent or deter violent acts at LAX, we can never guarantee that this will always happen. What we have learned from this incident is that when a violent attack occurs, speed and quickness, coupled with superior tactics, will be the key to saving lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Gannon. The chair recognizes Ms. Lindsay to testify.
Chairman Hudson, Chairman McCall, members of the committee, thank you very much for coming to Los Angeles International Airport and being willing to discuss the events of November 1. LAX is the largest origin destination airport in the United States, serving 66.7 million passengers through 9 different terminals. We host 95 passenger and cargo airlines that conducted 615,000 operations in 2013. November 1 was like any other busy Friday morning at Terminal 3 until an act of violence by a lone gunman set off a sequence of events of which you have heard a great deal. The suspect came to LAX in a vehicle driven by a friend and was dropped off on the departure level of the airport, just like many departing passengers. Mr. Ciancia was dressed as a typical traveler with luggage typically brought to the airports by passengers. Even after he was in custody, communications, traffic control, and tactical operations remained quite complicated. Airport police and their partner agencies did not know if there were other shooters. They did not know if there was a vehicle with a bomb or a secondary device placed in the airport area. Now, LAX handles about 200,000 passengers per day in its central terminal area, and it is a massive undertaking to make sure we keep everyone safe. As soon as dispatch was notified of the shooting, all landside airport access was shut down. We could only reopen once we were certain we were not putting anyone in harm's way. However, simultaneously, we were still accepting arriving flights, so the number of passengers in terminals and ultimately held on board aircraft continued to grow. While airport police quickly apprehended the suspect, significant travel disruption resulted for tens of thousands of passengers. At the time of the shooting, our best estimates are that there were 23,000 passengers in the terminals at LAX. Approximately 3,500 people in Terminals 1, 2, and 3 escaped onto the airfield and were then bused to appropriate holding facilities. That is the plan we have in place, and on that day, it worked. Other passengers and workers in Terminals 1, 2, and 3 ran out to the central terminal roadway. Those in other terminals and on aircraft were sheltered in place. While some passengers left LAX, others who were still expecting to depart on flights continued to arrive at the airport, adding to the congestion and the traffic gridlock outside the central terminal area. Of the 1,550 flights scheduled for LAX that day, 1,212 actually operated, although 74 of those were delayed. Airlines canceled 252 flights and diverted 86 flights to other airports. 16 arriving flights were held on board for longer than 30 minutes, since gates were not available once ramp workers evacuated. With LAX effectively shut down, there were ripple effects throughout the national air transportation system that impacted an estimated additional 1,500 flights. Remarkably, the airport returned to full normal operations 30 hours after the shooting on November 2nd. LAX staff established 12 evacuation and shelter sites and distributed 16,000 bottles of water. Several partner agencies assisted with passenger accommodations. LAWA also made extensive use of the news media, websites, and social media to communicate what information we had to the traveling public. In the past several months, LAWA has reviewed in detail every aspect of this incident and presented a comprehensive after-action report to Mayor Eric Garcetti and the Board of Airport Commissioners with several key findings. In preparing this 83-page report, we challenged ourselves to be better prepared for any future attacks or other disasters at our airports. The report assesses what happened, what could have been prevented, what response efforts worked well, and what areas of emergency management need to be improved. This report is available on LAWA's website. The most significant challenges on November 1 centered on mass notification and public communication, interim sheltering and customer care, given the duration of the event, the ability to mobilize an entire airport community in the response. LAX has already implemented a number of specific recommendations in the report and will be implementing others in the coming months. The report also concludes that the immediate tactical response by airport police was swift, heroic, and well executed. Collaboration with and support from response partners was effective. Terminal 3 was rapidly repaired and returned to service. We thank you for your attention to this matter and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lindsay. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cox to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you very much for the opportunity to testify, and what an honor it is to testify before a majority of the committee that has a southern drawl just like me, and so that's a very large honor today. First, I'd like to extend our deepest condolences to the family of Officer Hernandez and our best wishes for the full recovery of Officers Grigsby and Spear. Since the attack here in LAX last November, AFG has sought to understand how this tragedy happened and how others like it can be prevented in the future. Unarmed, unprotected, and exposed, TSA officers at Terminal 3 checkpoint were easy targets for a man with an irrational hatred of TSA and our officers. The results of our analysis are laid out fully in our written statement. But today, I will focus on our recommendations for improved security going forward. AFG strongly believes TSA should create an Armed Transportation Security Law Enforcement Officer, TS-LEO position, assigned to protect TSOs and passengers at airport checkpoints and other key locations. Deployment of duly trained and certified TS-LEOs would establish a consistent standard of protection. This is not a call for the arming of TSA officers. Rather, our proposal would establish a new law enforcement unit within TSA. As we have heard since November 1, current airport law enforcement operations have gaps and inconsistencies that leave TSOs and passengers vulnerable. Many airports have no armed law enforcement officers stationed at or in the airport. Even where they do, different decisions about tactics, staffing, and deployment have left many checkpoints without an armed law enforcement officer stationed there to provide security for our unarmed TSOs and passengers. Placing one or more armed TS-LEO at every checkpoint and at every key airport location will provide several security improvements, including integration of the law enforcement function into TSA operations, creation of a visible deterrent to those with criminal intent, as well as those who subject TSOs to verbal and physical assaults, and provisions for the quickest possible response when an attack occurs. In the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, I will simply list our additional recommendations. TSA should establish raised, protected installations at each checkpoint with bulletproof glass to allow armed officers to better observe the area, detect a problem before it escalates, and create a visible deterrent for those who might be planning an attack. TSA should continue to deploy TSOs and the new armed TS-LEOs to monitor exit lanes. TSA must ensure close coordination between airport and local first responders. The lack of coordination across such agencies at LAX on November 1 made a horrific situation even worse, as emergency medical attention for our wounded officers was delayed. AFG strongly encourages TSA to implement the recommendations in the November 2013 GAO report on scientific research and enhanced training to better identify threats to aviation security. We believe that will increase the likelihood that a BDO will be at the right place at the right time to detect and deter a potential attacker like the LAX shooter. Finally, TSA must immediately provide active shooter training to TSOs relevant to each airport, which includes interagency drills with other first responders. AFG also applauds Representative Julia Brownlee for introducing the Honoring Our Fallen TSA Officers Act, which would grant TSOs public safety officer status. Honoring public servants killed in the line of duty recognizes that a very small portion of the population volunteers to be put in harm's way to protect their country. H.R. 4022 should receive enthusiastic bipartisan support. We look forward to the same bipartisan support for the proposals we have made today. This concludes my statement. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. Chief Gannon, I'd like to start with you, sir. And let me say first that I agree with you that 4 minutes and 8 seconds is quite a remarkable amount of time that elapsed from the time you received the call to your officers took down the shooter. And so I just want to acknowledge the heroism of the officers that served under you and the work that they did and the preparation that you led up that in this instance. I think everyone recognizes their actions on that day were extraordinary, if not heroic.
Thank you. Very proud of them.
One of the issues that we've heard different information about was the location of the two officers in Terminal 3 that day. And I would just ask that we can get it on the record to be clear exactly where were the two officers that day.
One officer was using the restroom in an adjacent terminal, and the other officer was out on the airfield, which is a part of his responsibilities.
And my interest is not to try and play gotcha with any particular officer, but just to try to understand the policies. The officer who was in the restroom, was there a policy that an officer operates under when you're taking a break, that you notify someone, that you have someone cover your area, or was it standard operation just to quickly take that break and then get back on?
Well, yes, we have a policy, and yes, that policy is to ensure that we have coverage in that terminal. But for a restroom break, I don't hold somebody to making that kind of determination. I expect people to be able to use the restroom and get quickly back to where they are. So I don't have a particular problem with that. I have throughout my entire airport, or our entire airport, and through each of the terminals, we have a tremendous responsibility throughout those, whether it's in the departure level or at the arrival level in the baggage claim areas, or out on the airfield. There's a lot of different responsibilities that our officers have, and there's a number of people along the way that we're there to protect. But they're only one layer of security here at the airport. So a lot of focus has been on those two officers, but they're not the only officers that were working that day, nor they're the only officers who had responsibilities to that terminal.
Well, explain that a little bit, if you could briefly. Just what were some of the layers that day that would have overlapped with Terminal 3?
Well, in addition to the officers that we have assigned to terminals each day, we also have motor officers. We also have bike officers that were working that particular day. We have officers on foot beats throughout the terminals. We have officers that respond on mopeds. I have supervisors that are actively working in police cars, and we have roving patrol units that are working in the central terminal area that day. So there's the response to a shooter or to any incident that occurs in an airport is the responsibility of a number of different officers, not just the officers that are working that terminal each day.
Great. Well, thank you, Chief Gannon. Mr. Air Pistol, your testimony stated that TSA is recommending airport operators conduct active shooter training, and as I think was pointed out, LAX had just done such an exercise 3 weeks prior, and I think that contributed to the the performance of the officers of TSA as well as law enforcement that day in November. But are you working in coordination when you do these trainings with the local law enforcement at the airports? Could you maybe explain how that?
Yes, Chairman. So there's actually two aspects to the active shooter training. One is for the all TSA employees, not just TSOs, but all TSA employees around the country and actually around the world, to make sure that they know what to do in the event that an active shooter takes place at their place of work. So that's the one aspect. And there, as you know, there's three different types of training. One is basically an online course, which 98% of our employees have completed. The other is a tabletop exercise, which is often done more in conjunction with airport operators and police. And then there's the tactical training, which is done, and that's the training that was done 3 weeks before actually combined all three. And so I commend LAWA and the police in terms of doing that, because it probably did save lives from the standpoint of people knowing what to do to escape. We call it evacuation, but I think, as some people heard earlier, it's as much escape as it is evacuation, to know to get out of harm's way. And so that training is ongoing. It's done in concert with the airport authorities and police, and we're requiring that now to be done at least semi-annually for airports, all 447 airports around the country.
I appreciate that. And since I'm going to hold everyone else to their 5 minutes, rather than ask a question with 13 seconds left, I'm going to now yield to the ranking member of the full committee for any questions you may have, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much. Chief Gannon, simply put, how would the response to an active shooter situation differ today at LAX compared to what happened November 1st?
Well, I think that the response to the actual incident itself and to the shooting is tough to be faster, quicker, and than we did on that particular day. Part of the difficulties that we had on that day was coordinating all of the resources that responded to the airport. That was one challenge that we had, in making sure that we understood exactly where they were being put to work, and building out an effective incident command to be able to deal with those. The other issue is prevention. We've spent a lot of time wondering if we could prevent this incident. In this particular, given the case of Paul Ciancia, he was not on anybody's radar screen. I don't think that we could have prevented this in that regard. But there are ways in which we can educate our employees, educate people within the airport to be better partners with us and to be more observant as to what's going on, that maybe in behavior exhibited by Mr. Ciancia could have been identified and then acted upon before he had an opportunity to shoot. I don't think in this particular case it was, but we've put together a community policing-based approach to assigning officers to specific terminals to build relationships with people so that we get better information out of our employees.
Well, I guess my point I'm trying to get at is you have identified coordination,
yes,
as something that will be different now than before. Now, based on what we've been told during our visit here, it is still very difficult for the Laurel police to talk to Sheriff's Department, to talk to the LAPD. What are you doing, Ms. Lindsay, what are you doing to affect that interoperability issue that still exists?
Well, it still exists here. It exists throughout Southern California and throughout the Los Angeles area. The county is responsible for putting together an interoperability plan. They have a program called LA-RICS that is in development. We have developed our communication system to be compatible with LA-RICS, but that is still some time off. In the meantime, what we have done on the short term, for example, with fire and with LAPD, the units especially that work the fire stations associated with this airport, or LAPD officers that are on campus or close, is that we provide them with a radio which they can monitor for us, in which we can monitor their frequencies. We do have frequencies that we can talk to LAPD on our frequencies. So we do have interoperability to some degree, but not to the extent that I think we need in a major incident.
Ms. Lindsay?
I think the only thing I would add is that we are encouraging LA-RICS to take the steps that they need to take because we have already implemented the technology that they are ultimately going to implement. So there really isn't a whole lot more than encouraging them to take the steps they need to take that we can do from an airport perspective.
Mr. Cox, an active shooter situation is a difficult scenario. What are you recommending for a situation like this that the minimal kinds of training TSOs should have in that situation?
Number one, there has to be an opportunity for the TSOs to take the training. And remember, their jobs are very demanding. If people are lined up to get into the airports, it's hard for them to take time to get the training. So, number one, the time to do it, but training to understand what to do, how to get to the alarms that they are handy, having more radios, that it would be permissible to use their own cell phone to call for help, to get help immediately, how to evacuate themselves, passengers, where to go for a safe harbor type things. Each airport's a little bit different, as we all understand. They're built differently. But the training, and again, the freeing up of the officer to have the time to do the training. That happens in every organization in the government and the private sector where we struggle to get the time to do it.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just first take the opportunity to say thank you to our TSA officers out there. I think day in and day out, under very difficult circumstances, protect the traveling public from threats, whether it be a lone gunman or a terrorist. And we certainly appreciate the work you do. I know you don't always hear that, but I wanted you to hear that from the chairman. Let me just, Chief, I look at threats, risks, and vulnerabilities. Now, this airport has been under threats really since 9/11. It is a target, and it was certainly on that day. When I look at what was the weak point as I analyze this particular fact pattern, it seems to me that once someone goes through this proper screening, a weapon's going to be detected and picked up. So having the police officer on the, beyond that screening, post-screening is, it's helpful. But it seems to me the real vulnerability is before that process in the perimeter, if you will, before they go through screening. Also, in this case, the exit, where the shooter actually went through the exit to get into the terminal. I believe to push threats out. You want to push that threat out before it gets in. So what are your lessons learned in that regard when you look at what happened that day?
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I think that the threat for this airport starts on Century Boulevard at the entrance to the airport and extends through the curb area and the drop-off and into the terminals itself and up to the screening checkpoint is where our greatest threat occurs. And so our police presence should be our emphasis should be in those particular areas. That's consistent with the strategy that we've put together. That was consistent with the way in which last May, when we moved from that podium assignment where we had officers sitting or standing at a podium behind the screening, and to move them up front with that in mind to reduce the threat there. There are a number of challenges at any of our airport, and there are a number of issues that involve crime and other things that we have to address each and every day. But I also feel that it's important that we protect everybody in this airport environment to the best of our ability.
As Mr. Cox talked about, putting a police officer in front of each screening checkpoint would probably be ideal. We have obviously resources are an issue. However, are there ways to be agile, flexible, to keep the threat guessing. I think if you have one person always in one place, they're able to predict better in terms of the threat at that particular juncture. So, in other words, the flexibility and agility. Do you think that's important to sort of move these assets around at the airport?
I absolutely think so. I think if you're predictable, then you are vulnerable. And that's what I don't think we should be is predictable. And I don't want, to our best knowledge, anybody who's going to cause an issue here and take a violent act at this airport is probably going to watch and look and pay attention to what how we do our jobs each and every day.
And let me just say, because my time's run out, just say to apprehend the suspect under 5 minutes is pretty extraordinary. I do think we can always do better. I think had he not just been targeting TSA, we could have seen a lot more bloodshed that day. Administrator Pistol, when you look at resources, and we always have to look at that, as you well know, in the Bush Intercontinental Airport, it was a CBP officer, or I believe an ICE officer that actually responded. CBP and Terminal 3 were there. So you have a lot of different, you have the Viper teams that we saw today. You have a lot of assets around there. You have the police. You've got CBP officers, ICE, that can respond, that are armed and trained, unlike the TSOs. Can you speak to that in terms of bringing those resources together to prevent this kind of threat from happening?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. There are a number of challenges and opportunities, as you indicate, with the multiple layers of security that could be brought to bear. One of the challenges is to know how to integrate those different resources. So as Chief Gannon mentioned, it's one thing to have the airport police doing random patrols and having that unpredictable aspect of things, along with coordinating with our Viper teams, which of course is another layer of security there. When we start introducing other components, for example, of DHS, ICE, CBP, who have primary responsibilities elsewhere, then it becomes a question of what are we diverting them from in terms of those responsibilities, and addressing what risk and what threat. So we do try to balance risk, threat, vulnerability, consequence, as you mentioned, that formula for assessing risk, to make informed judgments. You mentioned about if we did have a special cadre of armed TSOs, I have several concerns about that, which I can go into later, but that's introducing more guns into a checkpoint on a fixed basis, I don't think is a solution.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I see my time's expired. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for any questions she may have.
Thank you very much. Let me just refresh the witness's memory. I started out by indicating that TSA is in the service of their country, in the service of protecting the national security of this nation. And I think that as we proceed with this hearing, it is a very key element, collaborating with local law enforcement. Chief Gannon, I again want to go on the record and say four and some minutes was a remarkable effort, and we thank you again very much. Ms. Pistol, in that direct thought of national security, you in 2013 did a vulnerability assessment of LAX with Transportation Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In my opening remarks, I alluded to the fact that TSA and TSO officers should have the ability to pick up an emergency phone line, and it should work. They deserve to know that a panic button, when they have been instructed to press it when an incident occurs, will work and prompt a response from local law enforcement. In an active shooting situation, that is crucial. And so my question is whether the vulnerability assessment that was done in November 2013 took into account the communication between first responders. I think we've raised that question. But then on the other hand, the ability of the transportation security officers to call for assistance in the event of an incident at a checkpoint, which I think is crucial.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. Actually, the most recent joint vulnerability assessment was just in February of 14, so just very recent, following the shooting in November, and it was part of a previously scheduled one. And so one of the things we look at with the FBI and the Airport Authority and the Airport Police is the communication, not necessarily in terms of interoperability of radio systems, because there's a number of challenges to that, both from a budget, a number of different of aspects. Does the airport police want to have TSA officers on their radio channels and communications, just like they would
Ms.
be on
Pistol,
ours?
I want to ask two other questions, so if you can summarize.
So the bottom line is they looked at a number of things, including communications. We did not look at communications, say, between first responders, between LA Fire, LA Police, LA Sheriff, and LAWA. That's not part of the Joint Vulnerability Assessment.
So can we add that now, the ability of a TSO officer to have immediate response based upon whatever is present for them to make that call?
So the question we do look at, or the issue we do look at, is do TSA officers have the ability to communicate directly with airport police? And the answer is yes to that, as the supervisory TSO did on November 1, 10 seconds after the first shot was fired.
But that was a red phone?
That was a red phone.
And so I think my point is we want to make sure that all that is operable from our perspective in the federal government.
Right, and LAWA police found that was not operative, so they've taken actions to correct that.
Yeah, let me quickly, is it in your mind very important for there to be a federal TSO professional organization as opposed to privatization? Does this really point out how important that is?
Well, yes, I believe that the TSA is a federal workforce, but
that it is important to be under the federal auspices as opposed to privatization.
Well, it is, but it also recognized Congress' mandate to have privatized screening.
Some of us disagree with that. Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Cox the importance of a trained professional TSO organization as opposed to privatization, and then might you comment very briefly on what you think is important about a separate law enforcement entity to TSO?
Number one, I think the American people had the outcry that they wanted the federal government to operate the screening at airports after 9/11. And since that time, TSA has done a fantastic job in protecting the flying public. And I clearly believe that that needs to be a function of government, and they're doing an excellent job. Part of it with having a law enforcement function in TSA, I commend the work of the police department here at the Los Angeles airport. They did a fantastic job.
Yes, they did.
Very, very brave officers that ran right into the situation. But at the same token, TSA, they need a law enforcement there. My good friend and colleague sitting beside of me would not be looking to the Phoenix Police Department to provide the security for his officers. He wants to do that. There needs to be some type of law enforcement inside of TSA to provide security at that checkpoint. There are still a very large airport, parking lots, all of those type things that have to be managed in an airport operations, in which we need the local law enforcement and the airport law enforcement to handle. But those checkpoints in TSA, it was one of ours that didn't get to go home to his family.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes.
Apologize for having to depart at this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for participating in this hearing. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, our host. If that's appropriate, we're in your congressional district, so we appreciate you joining us, Ms. Waters. We now recognize you for any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, and I certainly appreciate your being here. I'd like to thank Homeland Security Committee Chairman Michael McCall, Ranking Member Benny Thompson, Transportation Security Subcommittee Chairman Richard Hudson, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, who's sitting in for Ranking Member Cedric Richmond, for organizing this field hearing in my district entitled Lessons from the LAX Shooting, Preparing for and Responding to Emergencies at Airports. I want to begin by joining with my colleagues to honor the life and service of Gerardo Hernandez, the Transportation Security Officer, who was killed in the line of duty during the active shooter incident on November 1st. And I offer my deepest condolences to his family and friends. I also honor all of the TSOs, LAX police officers, and other first responders who risked their lives to stabilize the situation and protect the public on that tragic day. This hearing follows the release of 2 reports on the November 1st incident, one by the Los Angeles World Airports and the other by the Transportation Security Administration. And I am concerned about some of what was revealed in those reports. But I'm not worried because those things that were revealed, whether it's the red telephone or the panic buttons or even the inoperability, are things that can be fixed. And I think that Ms. Lindsay and Chief Gannon have already talked about a quick response to those kinds of things. They have the resources to do it, and they certainly will do it. I'd like to just spend a moment, if I may, to talk about the need for a consistent law enforcement presence at TSA passenger screening checkpoints, such as the one where Officer Hernandez was killed. Now, let me just say this. I know that there are differences of opinion about this. What I'm anxious to hear today and in the near future is that the discussion will continue. There may be things that can be tried. There may be alternatives. But what I do not wish to do is to simply have the issue put to rest at this time, because I am concerned that there may be a better mousetrap. I'm not sure. Following the shooting incident, I discussed airport security issues with leaders of the American Alliance of Airport Police Officers. Following our discussion, I wrote a letter to TSA Administrator John Pistol, in which I recommended that law enforcement officers be stationed within 300 feet of TSA passenger screening checkpoints. And I have a copy of that letter with me today, and with the committee's consent, I will include it in the hearing record. I was pleased to learn that TSA was responsive to the concerns that I raised and addressed this issue in its report. Specifically, TSA issued recommended standards calling for an increased presence of law enforcement officers at high traffic locations within the airport, such as peak travel times at checkpoints and ticket counters. However, TSA still does not require that law enforcement officers be consistently present at these checkpoints, even during the aforementioned peak travel times. The LAWA report, on the other hand, does not address this issue at all. LAWA implements a flexible response approach to security, which allows police officers to roam around the airport, but does not specifically require them to be present at the passenger screening checkpoints. The fixed post approach, by contrast, requires a police officer to be stationed at each passenger screening checkpoint. Airports and local police departments that support the flexible response approach have argued that this approach provides better visibility of police officers throughout the airport and less predictability for those who are intent on doing harm. I realize that a consistent law enforcement presence at TSA screening checkpoints is a controversial issue. However, I would argue that the fixed post and flexible response methods are not mutually exclusive. A major airport like LAX can have police officers at every screening checkpoint and still have additional officers patrolling the airport. If the United States Capitol Complex, where we work in Washington, D.C., can have police officers stationed at security checkpoints as well as additional officers patrolling the vicinity, then I think it is possible for LAX. Some airports and local police departments have also argued that stationing a police officer at every screening checkpoint is just too expensive. But I do not accept that particular argument. I do not want to compromise airport security in order to save money by paying for fewer police officers, regardless of which local, state, or federal agency is responsible for stationing officers at TSA screening checkpoints. A consistent law enforcement presence at these checkpoints is critical. I therefore look forward to a frank discussion regarding TSA checkpoint security today and in the future. However, I firmly believe that we should not adjourn without at least continuing to address this issue. And I want to thank Chief Gannon for his perspective on this. He gave me a new insight about predictability and the fact that if it is known that there's an officer at the checkpoint, they become easy targets. I appreciate that. I want to thank Mr. Cox because you gave us another way to look at this. You talked about how this possibly could be done. And that's why I think it's so important to continue the discussion, because I think we can be creative and we can try things. things. I think there's no reason why we cannot take several ideas, try them out, see what works best, but I don't want to give up on this discussion. I thank you for allowing me to be here today, and I thank all of you for the wonderful tour that you gave us today. It certainly gave us a better insight. This is an important facility. LAX is the economic engine of this area, all of the South Bay and my district. I appreciate you. I appreciate all of the tremendous responsibility that you have. I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady, and now I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Thompson for having this important hearing here today. As someone who travels every week, as my colleague Ms. Waters and I both do, to and from LAX, I have to say I feel very, very safe. But as Chairman McCall mentioned, we cannot be complacent, and I think this incident informs us on changes we need to make to improve all of our security. I want to thank Chief Gannon and all of the men and women who serve with you to protect us here at LAX, and to Mr. Pistol and all of the TSA officers who work very, very hard every single day, and who put their protection or put our protection over theirs every single day to ensure our safety. And I have to state that with serving, I believe, over 200,000 people every single day here at LAX, it is like a major public event that takes place every single day. So I want to thank all of the witnesses who are here today and their willingness to answer our questions, and hopefully the tragic, very tragic death of Transportation Security Officer Gerardo Hernandez and the wounding of other TSA employees and a passenger at LAX on November 1st will never, ever happen again. But it is incumbent on all of us to work together to identify possible improvements to safety and security for TSA employees and our traveling public. However, the shooting also raised another serious issue, and one that I believe we must address. As you know, current law does not provide TSA officers with death benefits like those offered to firefighters, police officers, FBI agents, or state troopers, and I'm just naming a few of the law enforcement personnel who all receive death benefits. That is why I have introduced the Honoring Our Fallen TSA Officers Act, which seeks to remedy this inequity. My bill would amend federal law to provide for the eligibility of a TSA employee to receive public safety officers' death benefits. As we have learned today, and the two TSA officers who are here with us today, Officers Rigsby and Spear, and all of the TSA employees who demonstrate courage and bravery every single day in hopes of never having another November 1st incident. God forbid that an incident like this ever happens again, as well as the husband of Ms. Hernandez, who is with us today. But if another TSA officer ever dies in the line of duty, I believe that these benefits are critically important to their families. So with that, I wanted to ask Mr. Pitzel, having served in the FBI and now with TSA, what is your opinion on whether TSO or TSA officers should be afforded the same benefits as the federal partners that help to secure this country every single day?
Well, first, Congresswoman, let me thank you for initiating the bill to recognize TSA employees as public safety officers to receive that benefit. Obviously, it would be tremendous benefit to TSA overall, particularly to the Hernandez family in this instance. And you're right, hopefully it would never be needed again. But I greatly appreciate your initiation and support of that, and would hope that that would come to fruition retroactively, obviously, and then be proactive in terms of any future losses. Tremendous appreciation and support on behalf of all the men and women of TSA. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I certainly would appreciate it if you and the organization could, and I know you have taken a look at the bill, but if you could take a deeper look at the bill and provide any feedback as we move forward with it, I would appreciate it very, very much. And I see that my time is almost expired, so I will yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentlelady, and I would like to recognize the chairman of the full committee for any closing statement you may have, Mr. McCall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say again to Anna, our thoughts and prayers are with you. I know we can never undo what's been done, but we want to make you whole again as much as we possibly can, and we're determined to help you. And to Administrator Pistol, thanks for the fine job that you do and your officers under very, as I said, difficult circumstances, particularly in this case. And Chief Gannon, the response time your officers responding to the threat in less than 5 minutes is to be commended. And finally, Ms. Lindsay, the one I didn't get to ask you a question, but I did want to close by commending you as well for the model that you've created of cooperation in your command center. I think it's important that the general public be aware of what you've done, even before this incident, but more so after, pulling together the relevant agencies to work together to better prevent threats like this from happening. Again, very similar to a Joint Terrorism Task Force model, where you bring all the relevant players into the same room with equipment, with the video equipment, so that, God forbid, something like this happens again, we'll be able to respond very quickly and protect the traveling public. So with that, I'll just close by saying, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership in holding this hearing. To Maxine Waters, thanks for hosting us in your fine district. You're a very lucky woman. The weather is very nice here. It's a little bit better than Washington, D.C. right now.
Yes.
Again, Mr. Chairman, thanks for your leadership.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank our witnesses for your testimony and the members for your questions today. I'm committed to working together in a bipartisan way to look at lessons learned, to make sure that Officer Hernandez does not die in vain, to do what we can as our responsibility as representatives of the people to go forward and make this country safer for the flying public, to assist the law enforcement, TSA, airport administrators around the country in the tough job they do every day. So I thank you for making this possible. I would point out that members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond to these in writing. But without objection, subcommittee stands adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, before you I just really realized that Mr. Tony Grigsby and Mr. James Spear, the officers who were shot, are here.
Yes, ma'am.
And I just wanted to thank you so very much. And I'm so pleased that you're getting well and you're back to work. Thank you so much. Thank
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, subcommittee stands adjourned.